May 1944, Kent countryside, England. The Allies fooled Hitler with fake tanks, and you'll be stunned at the deception that changed everything. A young American soldier kneels in a muddy field, connecting an air hose to what looks like canvas. Slowly, impossibly, a Sherman tank rises before his eyes, but it's not steel. It's rubber, 90 pounds of inflatable genius that will fool the greatest military mind in Europe. This isn't just one tank. It's an entire phantom army, complete with fake radio chatter, wooden bombers, and sound trucks playing recordings of massive convoys. General Eisenhower stares at maps, knowing that 156,000 Allied lives depend on this elaborate lie. Meanwhile, Hitler obsesses over the wrong beach, keeping his deadliest panzer divisions frozen in place. The Ghost Army creates divisions that exist only in German nightmares, while real Americans prepare to storm Normandy. But what happens when the master of blitzkrieg discovers he's been chasing shadows? Will rubber tanks and radio tricks be enough to fool the Führer, or will the greatest deception in military history crumble at the moment democracy needs it most? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning mist clung to the English countryside like a wet blanket as Private Tommy Sullivan connected the air hose to what appeared to be a pile of olive-drab canvas. The compressor hummed to life, and within minutes, the impossible happened. A Sherman tank rose from the meadow, complete with turret, tracks, and gun barrel. Sullivan stepped back, wiping his hands on his fatigues, and grinned at the sight. 90 pounds of rubber and canvas, but from 50 feet away, it looked like 30 tons of American steel. Colonel Billy Harris watched from the tree line, smoking a lucky strike as his men from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops worked their magic across the field. Harris had been skeptical when they'd first briefed him on Operation Fortitude back at the Pentagon. Inflatable tanks? Dummy artillery? It sounded like something from a Hollywood lot, not a military operation. But seeing it in action changed everything. The Ghost Army, as they'd started calling themselves, was creating an entire armored division out of thin air. "Sir, the sound truck is ready for the next demonstration," Sergeant Mike Kozlowski announced, approaching with a clipboard. The truck, painted to look like a standard supply vehicle, concealed speakers powerful enough to broadcast the recorded sounds of tank movements across miles of countryside. They had recordings of everything: convoy movements, artillery placements, even the distinctive whine of Sherman transmissions. Harris nodded, stubbing out his cigarette. "Run it, but keep the volume realistic. We're not trying to wake the dead, just fool the living." The irony wasn't lost on him. They were creating the largest phantom army in military history, all to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. Across the field, more inflatable Shermans rose like mechanical flowers blooming in fast motion. Each one was positioned according to strict military doctrine, proper spacing, tactical positioning, even dummy foxholes where tank crews would theoretically take shelter. The attention to detail was staggering. Camouflage nets hung at regulation angles. Tread marks led to and from each position, created by real jeeps dragging steel plates behind them. Sullivan finished inflating his tank and moved to the next position. He'd grown up in Detroit, watching real Shermans roll off the Chrysler assembly lines. His father had worked at the tank arsenal, cranking out the steel behemoths that were crushing Hitler's armies from Italy to the Pacific. Now here he was, inflating fake tanks to save real lives. The thought struck him as profoundly American, turning abundance into deception, using industrial capacity to create strategic advantage. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane droned overhead, too high to see clearly, but close enough to photograph. Harris smiled, imagining the German photo analysts who would soon be studying images of this armored division. They would count tracks, estimate strength, and report back to Berlin that the Allies had massed significant armor in southeastern England. Every fake tank represented a real German division that would be positioned to defend the wrong beach. The compressor wheezed to a stop as the last Sherman reached full inflation. 37 rubber tanks now occupied the meadow, arranged in perfect military formation. From the air, they would be indistinguishable from the real thing. Harris checked his watch, 0800 hours. In exactly 6 hours, a truck convoy would arrive, carrying wooden artillery pieces and more inflatable equipment. By evening, this empty field would house a complete armored division that existed only in German nightmares. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood before a wall-sized map of southern England, pipe smoke curling toward the fluorescent lights above. Red pins marked real Allied divisions, while blue pins represented the phantom units of Operation Fortitude. The blue pins outnumbered the red ones, a visual representation of the most ambitious deception in military history. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, pointed to clusters of pins around Dover and Folkestone. The Ghost Army reports successful deployment of the 11th Armored Division. German reconnaissance photographed the positions yesterday morning. Strong's British accent carried the weight of careful analysis. Ultra intercepts confirm Berlin believes we have 79 divisions in Britain. Eisenhower removed his pipe, studying the map with tired eyes. The truth was written in red pins, 52 real divisions, stretched thin across the invasion preparations. But the Germans saw 79, including an entire Phantom Army group under George S. Patton's command. The deception had to hold for just a few more weeks, long enough for Operation Overlord to establish its foothold in Normandy. "What's the latest from von Rundstedt?" Eisenhower asked, knowing the answer would determine the fate of the invasion. Strong consulted his briefing folder. Field Marshal Rundstedt continues to reinforce Pas-de-Calais. He's moved the 15th Army into position based on our Phantom buildup. 15 armored divisions, sir, sitting exactly where we want them, 100 miles from the real beaches. The weight of 156,000 lives pressed down on Eisenhower's shoulders. Every man loading onto landing craft at Portsmouth and Southampton represented someone's son, husband, father. The invasion plan called for acceptable losses, but those statistics translated into telegrams delivered to farmhouses across America. If the deception failed, if German panzers appeared on the Normandy beaches while his boys were still struggling ashore, those acceptable losses would become catastrophic casualties. Eisenhower walked to the window overlooking the English Channel. Somewhere beyond the gray waters, German coastal artillery waited behind concrete emplacements. Rommel's beach obstacles studded the tidal zones like steel teeth. But the real threat lay inland, the panzer divisions that could crush an invasion before it gained momentum. Those tanks had to remain frozen in place, chasing shadows while real Americans bled on real beaches. The Phantom signals traffic? Eisenhower asked without turning from the window. Maintaining full operational tempo, Strong replied. The WAF operators are broadcasting over 1,000 fake messages daily. Radio intercepts confirm German intelligence is cataloging our fictional units as hard intelligence. A knock interrupted them. Colonel Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's aide, entered with fresh coffee and the morning's operational reports. "Sir, General Montgomery requests final confirmation on D-Day weather conditions. The meteorologists are tracking a potential window on June 6th. Eisenhower accepted the coffee, feeling its warmth against his hands. June 6th, less than a month away. By then, Operation Fortitude would either be remembered as the deception that saved the invasion or the lie that collapsed under German scrutiny. Hitler's obsession with Calais represented the Allies' greatest strategic asset, but obsessions could change as quickly as weather patterns. Gentlemen, our boys are about to attempt the most audacious amphibious assault in history, Eisenhower said, turning back to the map. They'll succeed or fail based on 30 tons of rubber and canvas sitting in Kent Meadows. He tapped his pipe against the map table, scattering ash across the blue pins representing Patton's Phantom Army. If our ghosts can fool Hitler for another month, democracy survives. If not, he didn't finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the stakes. Failure in Normandy meant years more of war, millions more dead, and the possibility that Nazi Germany might develop atomic weapons before America could deploy them. The Ghost Army had to hold because there would be no second chances. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt adjusted his reading glasses and studied the intelligence summary spread across his desk at the chateau near Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Outside, spring rain drummed against the windows of what had once been a peaceful French estate. now converted into Fortress Europe's western command post. The Abwehr report detailed Allied strength in Britain, 79 divisions, including a massive concentration around Dover and Folkestone. Rundstedt's weathered finger traced the coastline on his map, stopping at Pas-de-Calais. 21 miles of water separated Dover from Calais, the shortest crossing, the most logical target. His decades of military experience confirmed what the intelligence report suggested. The Allies would strike where the channel was narrowest, where their fighter aircraft could provide maximum support, where the distance to Berlin was shortest. Herr Feldmarschall Colonel Alexis von Roen announced from the doorway, carrying additional reconnaissance photographs. As head of Foreign Armies West, von Roen had spent months tracking Allied preparations. The latest Luftwaffe photographs confirm significant armor concentrations in southeastern England. We count at least 3 armored divisions positioned for embarkation. Rundstedt accepted the photographs, examining them through a magnifying glass. Tank parks, artillery positions, supply dumps, all pointing toward Calais. The evidence was overwhelming, yet something nagged at his military instincts. 50 years of warfare had taught him that obvious targets often concealed hidden intentions. The telephone rang, interrupting his analysis. "Rundstedt," he answered curtly. "Herr Feldmarschall, this is Rommel." The Desert Fox's voice carried the urgency that had made him famous in North Africa. "I've completed my inspection of the Normandy defenses. We must discuss the allocation of reserves," Rundstedt sighed. Erwin Rommel commanded Army Group B, responsible for defending the invasion coast from Normandy to the Netherlands. Since his appointment, Rommel had obsessed over strengthening the Atlantic Wall, particularly the beaches between Cherbourg and Le Havre. But Rommel's focus on Normandy ignored the intelligence. Pointing toward Calais, the reserves remained positioned. "To counter the main invasion," Rundstedt replied. "All evidence indicates Pas-de-Calais as the primary objective. Evidence can be manufactured." Rommel's voice crackled through the static. "The Americans have the industrial capacity to create false buildups while concealing their true intentions. What if this concentration at Dover is deception?" Rundstedt studied the intelligence summary again. 79 Allied divisions represented an enormous force, larger than the German army that had conquered France in 1940. Even accounting for American industrial capacity, creating phantom divisions would require resources better spent on real equipment. No military commander would waste precious shipping space on deception when every ton of supplies meant additional combat power. "The Führer agrees with my assessment," Rundstedt said, invoking Hitler's authority to end the discussion. "Calais represents the most dangerous threat. The 15th Army remains in position to repel the invasion when it comes." After ending the call, Rundstedt returned to his maps. 15 armored divisions waited north of the Seine, perfectly positioned to counterattack any landing at Pas-de-Calais. If the Allies struck there, they would face immediate opposition from Germany's most experienced panzer units. The arithmetic of amphibious warfare favored the defenders. Attacking forces needed overwhelming superiority to establish beachheads against prepared positions. Von Roen cleared his throat diplomatically. "Herr Feldmarschall, there are some inconsistencies in the intelligence. Radio intercepts suggest significant Allied activity in southwestern England as well." Rundstedt waved dismissively. "Secondary forces, possibly a diversionary thrust toward Normandy or Brittany. The main attack will come at Calais. Every piece of evidence confirms it." He circled Pas-de-Calais on his map with a red pencil, marking the place where he believed the war would be won or lost. Outside, the rain continued falling, washing across the countryside where French farmers worked land their grandfathers had fought to defend. Soon, that same rain would fall on beaches where German and Allied soldiers would test their respective industrial capacities against each other. Rundstedt was confident in his analysis. The Allies would come at Calais, and when they did, they would discover that the Wehrmacht still knew how to fight. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit hummed with industrial symphony, the thunder of stamping presses, the whine of lathes cutting steel, the percussion of riveting guns assembling armor plate. On the main production line, workers in coveralls guided another M4 Sherman through final assembly, its 75 mm gun gleaming under fluorescent lights. This tank would join the thousands already shipped to England, adding to the steel avalanche preparing to crash over Hitler's fortress Europe. In a smaller building across the compound, a different kind of production line operated under strict security. Here, workers assembled inflatable Sherman tanks from rubber and canvas, complete with realistic details down to the bogie wheels and track tensioning systems. Each fake tank weighed 90 pounds compared to the 30 tons of its steel counterpart. But from aerial reconnaissance altitude, the differences vanished. Sergeant Frank Rodriguez supervised the rubber tank production with the same attention to detail he'd applied to real armor manufacturing. Before the war, Rodriguez had worked for Goodyear, helping develop the synthetic rubber technology that now served multiple purposes in the American war effort. The same industrial capacity that produced aircraft tires and tank treads also created the Phantom Army's confusing German intelligence. "Sergeant, we've got the sound equipment ready for demonstration," Corporal Pete Williams announced, pointing toward a modified truck loaded with recording equipment. The 3102nd Signal Service Company had spent months perfecting audio deception techniques, recording the sounds of tank movements, artillery firing, and supply convoys. Played through powerful speakers, these recordings could simulate military activity across miles of territory. Rodriguez nodded, watching as technicians tested the playback equipment. The recording captured the distinctive rumble of Sherman engines, the clank of tracks on hardpan, even the squeal of bogie wheels under load. Played at proper volume and distance, German acoustic intelligence would report significant armor movement where none existed. The contrast between real and fake production represented America's overwhelming industrial advantage. While Detroit cranked out 88,000 tanks during the war, German factories managed fewer than 50,000. American abundance allowed waste on a scale incomprehensible to resource-starved Germany. Entire divisions could be faked because real divisions existed in surplus. "Ship the next batch to England tonight," Rodriguez ordered, checking his production schedule. The Ghost Army reports successful deployment of the first shipment. German reconnaissance photographed our rubber Shermans yesterday morning. Williams grinned, imagining German analysts counting fake tanks as real threats. "Think they're buying it, Sarge?" "They're buying it because they can't conceive of the alternative," Rodriguez replied, lighting a cigarette. "To the Germans, every tank represents precious resources, weeks of production, months of training. The idea that we'd waste shipping space on fake tanks is beyond their comprehension." Across the facility, real Shermans continued rolling off the production line at the rate of one tank every hour. Each real tank destined for Normandy would be accompanied by rubber shadows in Kent, multiplying Allied strength in German calculations. The deception worked because it exploited German assumptions about resource scarcity, assumptions that no longer applied to American industrial capacity. As the evening shift arrived, Rodriguez watched another truck convoy load rubber tanks for transport to the docks. These shadows would cross the Atlantic alongside real equipment, taking up minimal shipping space but maximum German attention. In a few weeks, when Americans stormed ashore in Normandy, those fake tanks would be holding German reserves 100 miles away, proving that industrial abundance could be weaponized, just like steel and explosive. The production line never stopped, feeding the real invasion while simultaneously creating the illusions that would make it possible. Margaret Maggie. Cooper adjusted her headphones and settled into the radio operator's chair at the Women's Auxiliary Air Force Station in Kent. The building had once been a country estate, its elegant rooms now filled with wireless equipment and maps covered in military symbols. Through the window, she could see the neat rows of inflatable Sherman tanks that had appeared overnight in the adjacent meadow, part of the elaborate deception designed to convince German intelligence that massive Allied forces were massing for an assault on Pas-de-Calais. "Good morning." Maggie, Squadron Leader Patricia Williams, greeted her, carrying a clipboard filled with the day's transmission schedule. Ready for another day of phantom signals? Maggie smiled, checking her equipment settings. For the past month, she'd been broadcasting fictional radio traffic for units that existed only on paper. The U.S. 1st Army Group, under General George Patton's command. Every message was carefully scripted to create the impression of a massive military buildup preparing for the invasion of Europe at the closest crossing point. Start with the morning administrative traffic, Williams instructed, handing Maggie the first set of coded messages. Supply requests for the 11th Armored Division, casualty reports from training exercises, routine maintenance schedules. Keep it mundane but consistent, Maggie began transmitting, her fingers dancing across the Morse key with practiced rhythm. This is Baker 7 calling Charlie 3, morning report as follows. The messages contained enough military detail to satisfy German radio intercept services while maintaining operational security. Weather reports, equipment status, personnel movements, all the routine chatter of a real military unit. What made the deception particularly effective was Patton's involvement. German intelligence respected the American general's tactical brilliance, having studied his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. If Patton commanded the 1st Army Group, German logic dictated, then the 1st Army Group must represent the main invasion force. No competent commander would waste such talent on a diversionary operation. Excellent work, Williams commented, monitoring Maggie's transmissions. The intercept station reports that German wireless intelligence is cataloging our fictional units as confirmed intelligence. They're tracking divisional movements that exist only in our transmission logs. Through the window, Maggie watched British civilians walking past the inflatable tanks, many assuming they were observing real American armor. The deception operated at multiple levels, visual, electronic, and administrative. Even local pub conversations, carefully monitored by German agents, would confirm the presence of massive Allied forces in southeastern England. The telephone rang, interrupting the morning routine. Williams answered, listening intently before turning to Maggie with excitement. That was intelligence. They've intercepted German wireless traffic referencing our Phantom 11th Armored Division. Berlin believes it's real. Maggie felt a surge of pride mixed with responsibility. Her fingers on a Morse key were helping to create an entire army in German minds, an army that would keep 15 panzer divisions frozen in place while real Americans stormed different beaches. Every dot and dash transmitted represented lives that might be saved when the invasion finally came. Next transmission in 10 minutes, Williams announced, consulting the schedule. Artillery coordination exercise for the Phantom 83rd Infantry Division. Remember, keep the call signs consistent with previous traffic. As Maggie prepared for the next transmission, she reflected on the strange nature of her war service. Instead of operating radar or directing fighter aircraft, she was creating fictional military units through radio waves. Her war was fought with imagination and electronic deception. Yet the stakes were just as real as any bombing mission or fighter sweep. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the inflatable tanks that would soon be photographed by German reconnaissance aircraft. Combined with her radio transmissions, those rubber shadows would convince Hitler that the invasion was coming to Calais. It was the greatest lie in military history, told one Morse code transmission at a time. Hauptmann Klaus Weber steadied his reconnaissance camera as his Messerschmitt Bf 109 banked over the English countryside at 25,000 feet. The Luftwaffe pilot had been flying these missions for 3 months, photographing Allied preparations from his virtually invisible altitude. Below, the Kent countryside revealed its secrets through his camera lens. Tank parks, supply dumps, airfields bristling with bombers, all pointing toward an obvious conclusion. Achtung! Control, Weber radioed through his oxygen mask, photographing significant armor concentration grid reference Tango 7. Count approximately 40 tanks in tactical formation. His camera clicked steadily as he passed over the meadow where inflatable Shermans sat in perfect military array, indistinguishable from steel tanks through his telephoto lens. The irony escaped Weber completely. His sophisticated camera equipment, designed to penetrate enemy deception, was recording the greatest deception in military history as absolute truth. Each photograph would be studied by intelligence analysts who would confirm what German strategy already assumed. The Allies were massing for invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Banking east, Weber photographed additional targets along the Thames estuary. Landing craft clustered around docks and inlets, their numbers growing daily. What his camera couldn't detect was that many of those craft were canvas and wood, painted to look authentic from aerial reconnaissance altitude. The scale of the deception dwarfed anything previously attempted in warfare. More evidence of invasion preparations, Weber muttered to himself, photographing what appeared to be a major airfield construction project. Wooden bombers sat in neat rows, complete with camouflage and dispersal positions. German intelligence had been tracking this buildup for weeks, noting the concentration of strategic air power that would support the cross-channel assault. Weber's fuel gauge warned of approaching limits, forcing him to turn for home. His film canisters contained dozens of photographs that would soon reach the desks of German intelligence officers in Berlin. Those analysts would study each image with magnifying glasses, counting tanks and aircraft that existed only in Allied imagination. At Luftwaffe intelligence headquarters in occupied France, Major Otto Bauer received Weber's photographs along with similar reconnaissance reports from across southeastern England. The evidence was overwhelming. Massive Allied preparations focused on the Dover-Calais axis. Tank concentrations, airfield construction, naval preparations, all consistent with an invasion at the shortest crossing point. Herr Major, Sergeant Fritz Kellner announced, the latest photographs confirm our estimates. The Allies have positioned at least 79 divisions in Britain, with primary concentration opposite Calais. Kellner spread the reconnaissance photos across a large table, each image carefully labeled with grid coordinates and target identification. Bauer studied the photos through a magnifying glass, counting tank silhouettes and estimating force strength. His analysis would reach Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters within hours, reinforcing German assumptions about Allied intentions. The photographs provided concrete evidence supporting strategic decisions already made in Berlin. Prepare the intelligence summary, Bauer ordered. Emphasize the armor concentration in southeastern England. The Führer will want confirmation that his strategic assessment is correct. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What neither Weber nor Bauer realized was that their professional competence was being weaponized against them. Their accurate observation and analysis of false targets would convince Hitler to keep his most powerful reserves positioned to defend the wrong beaches. By the time German intelligence discovered the deception, American boots would be firmly planted on Norman soil, and the Ghost Army's mission would be complete. The camera never lied, but it could be fed a steady diet of carefully constructed truth that served Allied purposes better than any outright falsehood. The ramp of landing craft vehicle. Personnel 1453 dropped into the surf at 06:35 hours, June 6, 1944, and Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien stepped into chest-deep water under a gray Norman sky. Machine gun fire from the bluffs above Omaha Beach swept across the water like deadly rain, and O'Brien watched the soldier beside him pitch forward, his rifle disappearing beneath the waves. Move. Keep moving. O'Brien shouted over the chaos, pushing his men toward the beach that stretched ahead like a killing field. German 80mm artillery shells exploded in the surf, sending geysers of sand and seawater skyward. This was the moment Operation Overlord lived or died. 156,000 Allied soldiers had crossed the English Channel, but success depended on establishing beachheads before German reserves could counterattack. O'Brien's mind flashed to the briefings back in England, where officers had explained how phantom armies were holding German armor away from the beaches. 15 panzer divisions remained frozen near Calais, convinced that Normandy was merely a diversion. Those ghost divisions, created by rubber tanks and radio signals, now translated into lives saved on Dog Green Sector. Bangalore torpedoes. Corporal Tommy Rodriguez shouted, dragging explosive charges toward the concertina wire that blocked their advance. The beach obstacles that Rommel had planted, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, mines, created a maze of death that had to be cleared yard by yard. Behind them, more landing craft approached through the surf, carrying the follow-up waves that would either reinforce success or pile casualties on failure. The German defenders, in their concrete bunkers, had prepared for this moment for 4 years, but they faced something unprecedented in military history, an invasion supported by the entire industrial capacity of the United States. Every rifle carried by O'Brien's men represented American factories working 3 shifts daily. Every artillery shell fired in support came from production lines that outproduced the entire German war economy. "Get off the beach!" Lieutenant William Hayes screamed, leading a squad through a gap in the wire. The lieutenant had studied the intelligence reports about German dispositions. Thanks to the Ghost Army's deception, they faced only the 302nd Infantry Division, instead of the panzer counterattack that would have arrived if Hitler hadn't believed in phantom armies. O'Brien pressed forward, his bar chattering as he engaged German positions on the bluff. Around him, American soldiers displayed the same determination that had built the tanks, ships, and aircraft that made this invasion possible. Democracy had weaponized its industrial capacity, and now individual soldiers were proving that free men, properly equipped, could overcome any tyranny. By 800 hours, small groups of Americans had reached the base of the bluffs, beginning the process of reducing German strongpoints with dynamite and small unit tactics. The beachhead was fragile, measured in yards rather than miles, but it was expanding. Behind them, the English Channel, filled with ships disgorging supplies at a rate that dwarfed German logistics capacity. As O'Brien's squad cleared another bunker, he thought about the Ghost Army still maintaining their deception in Kent. Those rubber tanks were saving lives with every minute they convinced Hitler to keep his reserves away from Normandy. The greatest battle in history was being won not just by courage and firepower, but by imagination and industrial abundance working together. The beach that had seemed impossible to cross at dawn was now filling with American equipment and determination. Democracy had come ashore in Normandy, carried by men who understood that their survival depended on shadows cast by phantom armies 100 miles away. The port of Cherbourg had been reduced to rubble by German demolitions, but American engineers were already constructing artificial harbors along the Norman coast. Major General John Lee, commander of the communications zone, stood on an improvised dock watching Liberty ships disgorge supplies at a rate that defied comprehension. Trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition, fuel, food, everything needed to sustain an army group flowed ashore in an endless stream. "General," the daily tonnage reports, Colonel William Morrison announced, handing Lee a clipboard filled with statistics that told the story of American industrial supremacy. Yesterday alone, 15,000 tons of supplies, 2,500 vehicles, 40,000 troops were exceeding all planning estimates. Lee studied the numbers, each figure representing the triumph of democratic production over totalitarian resource management. Since D-Day, over 1 million Allied soldiers had crossed the Channel, supported by 177,000 vehicles and 700,000 tons of supplies. The buildup continued accelerating, fed by American factories that operated around the clock. Across the improvised port, the Red Ball Express was taking shape, a supply convoy system that would dwarf anything attempted in military history. Trucks loaded with ammunition, fuel, and rations would soon be racing across France at intervals that German logistics officers couldn't comprehend. American abundance was being translated into tactical mobility at a scale that made blitzkrieg obsolete. "What's the latest from the Ghost Army?" Lee asked, knowing that the deception units were still maintaining their phantom presence in Kent. German intelligence continued reporting on Allied units that existed only in Hitler's imagination, keeping crucial reserves away from the expanding Norman beachhead. "Still operational, sir," Morrison replied. Patton's fictional army group continues broadcasting radio traffic and maintaining visual deception. "German reconnaissance photographed our rubber tanks again yesterday morning," Lee smiled, watching another Liberty ship maneuver toward the beach. The contrast between Allied abundance and German scarcity was becoming obvious to anyone who understood logistics. While Americans landed supplies by the shipload, German forces relied increasingly on horse-drawn transport as fuel shortages crippled their mechanical units. A convoy of real Sherman tanks rumbled past, heading inland to support the breakout from the beachhead. These steel giants represented the culmination of American industrial mobilization. Detroit assembly lines, Pittsburgh steel mills, and Pennsylvania armories working together to equip democracy's armies. Each tank carried enough ammunition and fuel to outfight entire German units that lacked adequate supplies. General Lee, a young lieutenant, interrupted. Priority message from Chef. General Eisenhower requests confirmation of supply schedules for the August offensive. Lee nodded, understanding the implications. By August, Allied forces would be ready to break out of Normandy and race across France toward Germany itself. The supply system being constructed in Norman ports would feed an advance that German armies couldn't match or stop. Industrial capacity was becoming tactical mobility. As evening approached, Lee counted the ships waiting offshore, dozens of vessels carrying everything from toilet paper to tank destroyers. American logistics had transformed warfare from a contest of tactical skill into a demonstration of productive capacity. The Ghost Army's rubber tanks had enabled this transformation by keeping German reserves away during the crucial buildup phase. Standing on the dock, Lee could see the future of the war written in shipping manifests and tonnage reports. Germany would be defeated not just by better soldiers or superior tactics, but by the crushing weight of American abundance applied systematically to military objectives. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, and now democracy's industrial arsenal was pouring through the gap. The map room at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia felt like a tomb as the Führer studied the reports arriving from France. July 24, 1944, 7 weeks after the Normandy landings, and still no sign of the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Staff officers stood silently around the table, none willing to be the first to suggest what the evidence increasingly indicated. Mein Führer, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel began carefully. The situation reports from Normandy suggest Normandy is a diversion. Hitler slammed his fist on the map table, scattering reconnaissance photographs of Allied buildup in Kent. Patton's army group remains in southeastern England. The main attack will come at Calais when they judge our attention has shifted. General Heinz Guderian, the panzer expert, cleared his throat diplomatically. Mein Führer, perhaps we should consider repositioning some reserves. The Americans have landed over 1 million troops in Normandy. Their buildup is irrelevant, Hitler interrupted, his voice rising. We have 15 armored divisions positioned to crush the real invasion when it comes. Patton will not deceive me with this amateur theatrics. But even as Hitler spoke, doubts gnawed at his strategic assumptions. The scale of the Norman buildup defied explanation if it represented merely a diversionary operation. American ships arrived daily, disgorging supplies and reinforcements at rates that suggested major strategic commitment rather than tactical deception. Colonel Alexis von Rouen entered the briefing room carrying the latest intelligence, summaries from Britain. As head of Foreign Armies West, von Rouen had been tracking Allied preparations for months, but recent reports created disturbing contradictions in his analysis. Mein Führer, aerial reconnaissance continues to confirm Allied concentrations opposite Calais, von Rouen reported, though his voice lacked conviction. However, wireless intercepts from Normandy indicate significant American units that should be in England preparing for the main assault. Hitler studied the photographs of Allied camps in Kent, not knowing he was examining an elaborate stage set created by the Ghost Army. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and canvas landing craft continued their mission of strategic deception. But the window of effectiveness was closing as reality became impossible to ignore. Rundstedt requests permission to move reserves, Keitel added. The situation in Normandy is becoming critical. American armor has broken through our defensive lines. Absolutely not. Hitler's reply echoed through the bunker. "The moment we weaken Calais, Patton will strike." I will not be fooled by Roosevelt's crude attempts at misdirection. Outside the briefing room, junior officers whispered about the impossible contradictions in their intelligence. How could Patton command phantom armies in England while American divisions bearing his former subordinates' names fought in Normandy? How could a diversionary operation consume resources on such a massive scale? The truth was visible to anyone willing to see it, but Hitler's obsession with Calais had become an article of faith that reality couldn't penetrate. The Ghost Army's mission was succeeding beyond its creator's wildest expectations, not just deceiving German intelligence, but paralyzing German decision-making at the highest levels. As the briefing concluded, Hitler returned to his study, leaving his generals to wrestle with orders that made no military sense. 15 armored divisions remained frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while the real war raged 100 miles away. The greatest deception in history had become a trap from which German strategy couldn't escape. General Eisenhower spread the production statistics across his desk at SHAEF headquarters, each number telling the story of industrial democracy's triumph over totalitarian resource management. The figures seemed impossible even to the architect of victory, American. Factories had produced 88,000 tanks during the war, while Germany managed fewer than 50,000. But these weren't just statistics. They were the mathematical proof of why Operation Fortitude had succeeded. "The Germans never understood our fundamental advantage," Eisenhower explained to his staff, lighting his pipe while studying the tonnage reports. They calculated Allied strength based on European assumptions about resource scarcity. They couldn't conceive of an economy that could waste shipping space on rubber tanks. Major General Kenneth Strong, the intelligence chief, pointed to specific comparisons that revealed the scale of American production. "Sir, we built 2.4 million trucks compared to Germany's 346,000. We produced more landing craft in 1944 than they built tanks that entire year." The Ghost Army succeeded because it exploited their inability to comprehend our abundance. The office walls displayed charts showing production curves that told the real story of World War II. While German output peaked in 1944 and then collapsed under bombing and resource shortages, American production had accelerated throughout the conflict. Democracy had outproduced totalitarianism by ratios that made military genius irrelevant. Colonel Harry Butcher entered with additional reports from the War Production Board. "General, final tallies from Detroit. We built more Sherman tanks in 1943 alone than Germany produced of all tank types during the entire war. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant manufactured B-24 bombers faster than Germany could train replacement pilots. Eisenhower studied a photograph pinned to his planning board, an inflatable Sherman tank sitting beside a real one in a Kent meadow. Both had contributed to victory, but only American industrial capacity could afford to manufacture phantom armies while simultaneously equipping real divisions for global warfare. The deception worked because it was mathematically plausible, Strong observed. German analysts looked at our production figures and concluded we could waste resources on elaborate deceptions while maintaining overwhelming combat strength. They were right. We could and did. The Supreme Commander reflected on the strategic implications of industrial superiority. Operation Fortitude hadn't just fooled Hitler about Allied intentions. It had demonstrated that democracies could weaponize their productive capacity in ways that totalitarian systems couldn't match or counter. Free markets and voluntary cooperation had proven more efficient than slave labor and central planning. Gentlemen, this war was won in Detroit and Pittsburgh before it was won in Normandy, Eisenhower concluded, tapping his pipe against the map table. Our soldiers displayed magnificent courage, but they carried weapons produced by a system that Hitler never understood. We didn't just defeat the Wehrmacht, we overwhelmed it with abundance. A clerk entered with the final casualty reports from the European theater. Over 400,000 American dead, each name representing a family's loss and a democracy's sacrifice. But the Ghost Army's deception had prevented those numbers from being far worse by keeping German reserves away from the beaches during the crucial early days as Eisenhower prepared his final report to the combined chiefs of staff. He understood that future military historians would study Operation Fortitude as proof that industrial capacity could be as decisive as tactical brilliance. The rubber tanks in Kent had saved more lives than any conventional weapon by exploiting Germany's fundamental misconception about American abundance. The mathematics of victory were written in production. Statistics that told a simple story. Free peoples, properly equipped and organized, could overcome any tyranny. The white crosses stretched across Normandy American Cemetery in perfect formation, each marker representing a young American who died believing that democracy was worth defending. Margaret Sullivan knelt beside grave number 3847, placing fresh flowers on the soil that covered her son Tommy, the soldier who had inflated phantom tanks in English meadows before storming real beaches in Normandy. He saved lives with rubber and canvas before he gave his own with rifle and courage, she whispered, reading the inscription on the marble cross. Around her, thousands of other families had made similar pilgrimages to honor sons who fell liberating Europe from tyranny. The Ghost Army's success had prevented these numbers from being far worse, but statistics offered little comfort to grieving mothers. Colonel Billy Harris stood among the graves, now retired but still haunted by the mathematics of war. His 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had succeeded beyond all expectations. Their Phantom divisions had immobilized 15 German armored divisions during the critical weeks when beachheads were most vulnerable. Military historians estimated that without the deception, Allied casualties on D-Day alone would have been 50% higher. Sir, a young veteran approached Harris, using a walking stick to navigate between the graves. I was at Omaha Beach with the 1st Division. The briefing officers told us that fake tanks were keeping German reserves away. I never believed it until now. Harris nodded, understanding how impossible the operation had seemed, even to those who executed it. Creating entire armies from imagination and industrial excess required a kind of thinking that European military traditions couldn't comprehend. Only American abundance had made such strategic deception possible. A French official placed a wreath at the cemetery's memorial wall where the names of the missing were carved in stone. These men had disappeared into the chaos of battle, their bodies never recovered, but their sacrifice remembered. Many had died believing that their Phantom divisions would save lives by keeping German reserves away from the invasion beaches. The boys who inflated those tanks saved my life, the veteran continued, pointing toward the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. German panzers should have been waiting for us, but they were 100 miles away, chasing ghosts. Every rubber tank in Kent was worth a dozen real tanks in Normandy. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cemetery, Harris reflected on the costs and benefits of democratic warfare. American industrial capacity had created weapons of deception alongside weapons of destruction, proving that free societies could innovate faster than totalitarian systems could respond. But innovation couldn't eliminate the human cost of victory. A group of French school children toured the cemetery with their teacher, learning about the Americans who had died for their liberation. The teacher explained how Phantom armies had helped make the invasion possible, turning industrial abundance into strategic advantage. These children would grow up in freedom because young Americans had been willing to fight for principles larger than national interest. Margaret Sullivan rose from her son's grave, carrying the knowledge that his service had extended beyond individual heroism to collective strategy. Tommy had helped save democracy by creating illusions that confused dictators, proving that imagination could be as powerful as ammunition when supported by industrial abundance. The cemetery represented the price of victory, but also its meaning, that free peoples, properly motivated and equipped, could overcome any tyranny, willing to challenge them. The Veterans Reunion in 1996 brought together the surviving members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops for the first time since their unit's disbandment in 1945. For 50 years, Their contributions to victory had remained classified, their stories sealed behind official secrecy acts that prevented recognition of their unique service. Now, in a hotel conference room in Washington, D.C., elderly men shared memories of the war's most successful deception operation. "I still can't believe it worked," Frank Rodriguez said, studying a declassified photograph of inflatable Sherman tanks arranged in perfect military formation. The former rubber tank specialist was now 78 years old, but his eyes still sparkled with pride at what they had accomplished in English meadows over half a century earlier. Colonel Harris, now retired and wearing civilian clothes, addressed the small group of survivors. "Gentlemen, military historians have concluded that our operations saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by keeping German reserves away from Normandy during the critical early weeks. We created armies that existed only in Hitler's nightmares." The Ghost Army's legacy had been preserved in boxes of photographs, sound recordings, and operational reports that documented the most ambitious deception in military history. Rubber tanks, wooden aircraft, and scripted radio transmissions had convinced the German High Command that 79 Allied divisions were preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais when only 52 real divisions existed in Britain. "What amazes me," Pete Williams observed, "is how completely they bought it. German intelligence never suspected that we could afford to waste resources on fake armies while building real ones. They couldn't conceive of American abundance on that scale." The reunion included presentations by military historians who had studied the Ghost Army's techniques and effectiveness. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the Army War College explained how Operation Fortitude had revolutionized military thinking about deception, proving that industrial capacity could be weaponized through imagination as effectively as through conventional production. "Your unit represented something unprecedented in warfare," Dr. Morrison told the veterans. "Previous military deceptions involved hiding strength or concealing intentions. You created strength that didn't exist, convincing enemies to defend against phantom threats. While real forces struck elsewhere, the declassified documents revealed the scope of their success in mathematical terms that staggered even the participants. 15 German armored divisions, over 300,000 troops and 3,000 tanks had remained immobilized for 7 weeks based on intelligence reports about units that existed only in Allied imagination. The strategic impact dwarfed any conventional military operation of similar size. As the reunion concluded, the veterans posed for photographs beside displays of their original equipment. Inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and radio sets that had once fooled Hitler now resided in museums as artifacts of democratic ingenuity applied to military necessity. The final photograph showed 12 elderly men standing together, representatives of a unit that had proven imagination could be as decisive as ammunition. Behind them hung a banner reading, "Ghost Army, Shadows that Saved Democracy," summarizing their contribution to victory in terms that future generations would remember. Their deception had worked because it exploited totalitarian assumptions about resource scarcity, proving that free societies could innovate faster than dictatorships could respond. The rubber tanks were gone, but their legacy endured as proof that democracy's greatest weapon was the abundance that made even elaborate lies militarily affordable. If you enjoyed the story I handpicked, this next story that you will enjoy, please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.